Hi guys. Great to be back at FreightWaves. We should have some fun today. I do have a flag. I'm not planning on using it. Give me a whistle. That'll hurt all of our ears. But we've got some good content today, and since we've got the visiting team, we're going to have Noel go first. So Noel, we've recently went through an election, probably one of the most talked about ones in a long time. And the results are now finite, and we know what did happen. But what is going to happen, and how is that going to impact trucking and the economy over the next 4 years?
Well, let's start with Donald Trump, my college classmate. Obviously, a 1968 grad from Penn will help the country a lot. Anything else? I'm going to take part of this question, and it's I'm going to focus on regulation. And I'm a Austrian economist. That means I like free markets. And most truckers, while they may not recognize they are Austrian economists, they are. And it's really good to have a president who is light on regulation rather than heavy on regulation. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The upcoming change in emission regulations is likely to go much more easily because of the Trump administration. That's one. Two, the AB5 issue in California, which the Democrats would love to spread across the whole country. That trend will definitely slow for the next 4 years. And the big one is we were looking at a change in speed limits in 2026, I believe, which would have been the biggest regulatory shock in the history of the industry, not to include deregulation. That was a regulatory shock of a different sort. That is almost certainly dead. So with respect to operations, and that's the part that I'm starting with here, the Trump administration is definitely a plus for the trucking industry.
Well, thank you. Zach, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you pointed out something very clear there, that's beneficial to operations. The thing to note is all of the things that you mentioned were clear barriers to capacity. It's not necessarily, yes, it may make your day-to-day easier. Driving a truck may make it a little bit more fluid for your operation to be able to go faster. But all that does is mean that we don't need as much capacity in the market. And therefore, you're creating an environment where we already have an oversupplied environment. So that's only going to feed into a bit of an oversupply, because regulations in general, not all of them, they're barriers to entry. A lot of the lobbying that goes on from the truckload associations are to create barriers to entry. A ELD was supposed to be some level of capacity limitation in a lot of the minds of a lot of the operators out there. So it's regulations, whereas it may make operating easier and the day-to-day easier for anybody out there, but it's not necessarily something that benefits the market in the way that it restricts capacity.
Noel, do you agree? Do you think that these regulations will actually make more capacity and thus impact the recovery in trucking even longer?
I'll change it only in this way. The marketplace is slowly headed back towards equilibrium. And this change, I think, Zach is right, will make that move of capacity back to equilibrium more slowly. And I'll state it flatly just to emphasize what Zach says. The industry hates regulation. And yet we get good times only, this is the fact, we get these booms only when there is a dramatic increase in regulation. So you could take the view that my colleague has, is that regulation is a great thing for trucking. As an Austrian economist, I'm from West Philly. I've got some other words that would express my disapproval. Now let me change the topic, if I may.
Please.
With respect to regulation, I mean the administration. We just talked about two sides of the same problem, and that's the advantage. By the way, when you get two economists, you want them to disagree, because that gives you two views, and then it's up to you to choose which one of us is right. It's not for me to say I'm right when there's a legitimate other argument in the place. My job is to let you know what the arguments are. So with respect to the economy and trucking, there's a two-side equation here, and I'll give the first side, and I hope Zach will follow with the second side. It is likely that the Trump administration will push through a tax cut pretty quickly, and if 2016-17 is a good example, it will, in the short term, stimulate the economy. So Zach talked about the supply side being more constricted. The demand side is likely in the first year and a half, to be stronger because of the tax cut. As an Austrian economist, I hate that statement, but it happened and it's likely to happen again. So I have a forecast, and then I'll turn it over to Zach. Somebody suggested that Trump will retire halfway into his term after he declares victory. Well, here's a scenario where the economy booms for a couple years, and he says, I was right, see ya.
Interesting. Let's start with that.
Let's unpack that.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that statement, Zach?
So in regards to the demand stimulus occurrence with the Trump administration, I think history is, pretty reliable in this circumstance. Trump is going to probably do a lot of things that will stimulate the economy, and therefore demand, and therefore the trucking environment. But at the same time, we have to be careful. There's the sense of overstimulation. These economic bubbles, this volatility, this cycle of volatility that we've been in. And it started before Trump had probably a lot of his policies in place, with the 2015-16 environment where we had, I guess, a freight recession to an extent in 2016, largely due to some industrial manufacturing downturns. But that was followed by a 2017 environment that was pretty robust, thanks in large to a lot of the tax cuts and the stimulating packages that went into place. What happened in 2018 and 2019? That came to a crashing end for a lot of the truckload operators. We had the largest single exit in history there at the end of 2019. So that was also a pretty deep freight recession in its time, and that was created by a pretty robust upturn in overall demand. So the one caveat I would throw out there to all of this is overstimulated economies are also unhealthy in the long term. The short-term gains feel really good, but that's what leads to a lot of people entering the truckload market like they did during COVID, and then oversaturating the market with a lot of capacity. So that's the one caveat to having, yes, I think in the near term we've got a pretty bullish outlook. I don't know about Trump hitting the retire button in the middle of his term, but I think that would probably still, I think a lot of the policies that he puts in place will already have had a lot of their impact at that point anyway.
If you're right, and I think you're right, he will wish that he retired in 2029?
Right.
An example of what Zach was talking about. I was an Air Force navigator. You've probably seen the hat that I wear. Here's one of my navigator's watches. During the boom of 2021, I bought 4 watches just like this. What do I need 4 watches for? Or put differently, I'll never buy another watch,
right,
just like he predicted.
Well, and that's what I was going to bring up. If you look at what happened in COVID with spending, right, especially being stuck at home and everybody bought everything that they needed or 4 times what they needed. We're seeing cryptocurrency at all-time high. The stock market's out of control in a good way for now, right? But like you said, this becomes so temporary, right? So quickly, so temporary. So how does that impact the people in this room who want to know, like, do I buy trucks? Do I raise my rates? Do I contact my shippers? Like, what is your, because you guys are on the spot right now. I'm going to each hold you guys to this. This is recorded. What do you think that actually will be happening over the next 6 to 12 months?
6 to 12 months. I hate to say this because it lowers the value of both of us, but the most likely case is always whatever happened last month will happen again. The catch, what he's really asking is, when the unusual quarter happens, when things change, they change a lot. And I would put it this way, and so what you should be listening for between the two of us is the risk element. And my answer is that for the next, and let's just say 18 months, that the risk is very small of a change, and so no recovery, no much better, no much worse, just the same. But as we get towards the end of those 18 months, the risk rises relatively dramatically, and the risk is, I'll start this debate by saying it's on the downside. So if I'm planning my equipment purchases, or if I'm planning my contract negotiations, I want to make sure that I'm okay a year from now if the economy weakens. I know I can survive now. Can I survive a year and a half from now if the economy weakens? So I think this is the time to have a hedge.
Yeah, I think the one thing that you have to plan for over the next 6 to 12 months is volatility. I don't like, we've had this nice little smooth transitory environment. You know, if you listen to Craig and I on State of Freight yesterday, it's been starting since May of 2023. You know, you look at our tender rejection index, it's gone from 2.5% to 6% over the course of 18 months. That's a very long, drawn out increase of about a load or two a month being rejected by a carrier. It looks stronger than it probably is to a lot of the operators. However, as Noel said, at the end of the cycle, because capacity is bleeding out, because spot and contract rates are starting to close together, the likelihood of a pretty dramatic shift becomes increasingly likely. This is just math. This is basic math gaming of the system. When you're seeing the end of a cycle approach, which is what we're seeing, we saw it in 2017. A lot of us didn't see it because we didn't have a lot of data. We didn't have a lot of information that wasn't fast enough to really get us in the position to be like, oh, we're starting to see things shift. We've never seen data that would allow us to really measure it on a weekly cadence. It's always 30, 60 days lag. Now, with the age of information, technology really spreading, I think we're able to actually see what has been occurring every single freight cycle in history. There's always been a slow transition and then some level of exogenous event, whether it be a hurricane or COVID or something like that, that would throw the cycle into turmoil. And I think that is the thing that you really have to be careful with, especially considering the policies of the current administration. Now, a lot of those policies are very stimulating, but at the same time, like I said before, that stimulating effect could be one of the things that triggers another sharp change in the market.
All right, I didn't like either of your guys' answers, so I'm going to throw a flag out. Let's be more specific. Are we going to have a peak season? When's the next time that's going to happen? Is peak coming back? I've seen some data. Kevin Nolan showed me some data yesterday showing rates coming up. We've seen SONAR's data. We've seen, are we going to see a strong end of this year?
I don't think there is a peak anymore.
You don't think there is a peak?
Unless you want to talk about a little bit at the new year.
Okay.
The data is beginning to show that, but it used to be a big fall peak.
Right.
Here's why there's no big fall peak anymore. When does Home Depot put the Christmas decorations on the shelves now? The end of September?
That's a good point.
Yeah, July, he says. That's right. And what they figured out is they have extra shelf space in the store after the summer stuff clears out. Rather than waiting to bring that stuff from China in October for November sales and paying a premium, they can get cheap rates in August and bring it in and put it in the store and let it sit there. So the only peak that I've seen recently, and I'd love to hear what Zach has to say, the last 3 years, and that's not very long to establish a trend, but the last 3 years, there's been something really wacky in the dry van business in the last week of the old year and the first week of the new year, having to do with, I guess, online sales. So that I expect to happen. So my answer with respect to rates, with peak rates, is you're not going to get a lot of help until Christmas.
Zach, peak, no peak?
Oh, we're going to have a peak this year. The thing about peak season is that it's not a demand-side driven event. That is a big misconception. If you look at data, you'll see that demand actually declines during the month of December. It's also down in early January compared to a lot of the more voluminous, for lack of a better word, months, which are around June and the beginning of July. That's actually From a volume standpoint, that is traditional peak. The difference is shippers' sense of urgency at the end of the year has increased exponentially because you have holidays, you have an end of another quarter, and then you have an end of a fiscal year. They have to get their goods moving, and they have to be there to protect revenue. If the goods are not there to protect revenue, then they lose out. And then you have these two major holidays. Drivers take vacations. Carrier operators boundary all their drivers within a 500-mile radius so they can get home time. That's the natural peak season mechanism. It's not necessarily that we have this huge amount of freight moving in the country. And whereas, to your point, Noel, that Home Depot and everybody has their Christmas decorations out in July now, which is facts, but peak season is driven not just by demand, but more by a supply-side constriction. And we're already seeing rejection rates up. We're already seeing spot rates really percolate at a time where we have not seen them percolate in the last 2 to 3 years. Even during COVID, we didn't have like a strong movement in early November versus where it was. Now, they were already high, but right now we're already seeing an early sign of percolation in the market that hasn't existed before, and we still have, 10 days before Thanksgiving? Typically that doesn't happen.
So I think what you're saying, and I'm going to leave this to you, is that the great freight recession has ended. Noel, is that fact or fiction? Is it over?
Oh, recession?
The great freight recession, yes. I know you may have some...
We haven't talked about the difference between contract and spot markets.
Okay.
There was no recession in the spot business. In the contract business, none whatsoever. We are still about 10% above normal in terms of demand. Prices are normal in terms of long-term measurement. They're not what they were in 2021, but that was a windfall. Now, as human beings, we say, oh, isn't that wonderful? I'll give you an example. 2017, the Eagles won the Stupid Bowl. I thought that was going to happen every year after that. Well, the truck market hit a Super Bowl in 2021. It hasn't come back. Now, having said that, on the spot side, and much of what we're talking about here, there has been a very bad freight recession. And the reason is not fundamental demand, as Zach talked about with respect to Christmas. It's that people that were throwing a bunch of extra stuff business onto the spot market because they needed odd locations and all that stuff that happened in 2021, that's over. So they said, oh, bring it back to my contracts where I have better rates and more easier operations. And so all of that extra business that swelled the spot market in 2021, late 2020, went back to contract. And that has flattened. We're at the bottom, but we're still way below average. Contract is here with respect to average, spot is down here. And if we, here's a picture of the whole market. Go to the next one. And you can see what happens to spot share. It goes up and down with the cycle. And you can't read this thing here, but let's see. Well, the big bump there on your right is when everybody needed special movements during the COVID crisis. Let's go to the next slide. And so here's the spot market loads. It reflects that share difference. Show me one more.
Sure.
Here's contract pricing, a little bit of a nice boom, but not nearly as much as the spot side. Now let's look at the spot side. Big. Even a Dallas Cowboy fan knows the difference between a big change in price and a little change in price.
Zach, I think he's saying there was no freight recession, at least in part of the market. Do you want me to go to your slide?
Yeah, let's go to my slide. Let's talk about the spot to contract market. Now, there are two different variations of contract rates in the domestic truckload market. The ones that we have here in the white line that you're looking at, those are the primarily shipper to carrier relationship contract rates. They operate nominally higher than your 3PL or 4PL managed freight, and that's because 3PLs, brokerages, can navigate a much broader and deeper set of carrier base, and they are really good at negotiating, and that's their value add in the market. So their natural tendency when you talk about the broker to shipper contract rate is going to be somewhat closer to the green line or yellow line there in the NTIL that we exclude a little bit of fuel costs for. So our view on the contract market itself is fundamentally different because we're looking at the shipper-to-carrier relationship a little bit more closely here because shippers want to consolidate their carrier bases in times where we see contraction in the market, where they can get some deflationary pressure on rates. And the freight recession started arguably when the spot market collapsed in March of 2022. But then the contract rates, which move much slower because they're negotiated on a 12-month cycle, and on average, started to come back down several months later. And the thing we're seeing now, at the end of the freight recession, contract rates are starting to move up. Spot rates have been moving up, to Noel's point, since May of 2023. We've bottomed out. The contract space still kind of cleaning out some of that mess, that noise. But if you were looking at contract rates that were closer to that 3PL, that managed transportation side, it wouldn't look as closely correlated to the white line that you see here. It would look more closely correlated with the line that you see in the yellow, which is why you would see spot rates increasing over the last bit. But there's no doubt there was some level of recessionary pressure because, bottom line, both rates fell for a very long time, which means there was more supply than demand.
So you've got an interesting slide here, Noel, that you did not talk about. Go ahead. Do you want to
Well,
talk about?
there's a real important semantical point, which is the only difference between what Zach's saying and what I'm saying. What does the word recession mean? If you're a macroeconomist, it means something like the economy is shrinking for 2 quarters or more. So the recession is the down part. So let's use the football analogy again. The Dallas Cowboys are in recession. 3-9, is it now? They're down there. If the Eagles lose next week, the Eagles are 9-2. If the Eagles lose next week, they're way up here. But if they lose, everybody on the Philadelphia papers is going to be moaning about the recession in the Eagles' performance. It went from here to here. So if I can use Zach's,
Let me go to Zach's
back
slide.
up.
Yes, sir.
If I can use Zach's great slide there, that's a peak up there. Here's a recession in economic terms. Let me go back to English. From the peak, from here to there, the contract market is receding, going down. So the question is, if you say we're in a freight recession, are you talking about it just wasn't as good as last month, or are we talking about it really is awful? And my point is, on the spot side, as we see here, it was awful. Contract side, no, normal. Just wasn't what we wanted. And it receded from great to okay. Great to disappointing, whereas the other one was super great to pretty bad. So it's a semantical issue. And here's the point about doing this for a business. If you're in the spot market right now, a carrier, you've got big problems, and you got to figure out how to survive when you're only getting, what, 80 cents on the dollar? If you're J.B. Hunt or Werner, mainly contract guys, you're trying to figure out how to get more profitable, but you're not trying to find a way to survive. And as a matter of fact, the big guys are adding capacity, and they've been doing so for a year because they're not down there, they're still up there. So, you know, it depends on the words that you use.
Zach?
You know, it's interesting that you use the Cowboys here, and one would argue they haven't had greatness since the early 90s. But that being said, a much longer timeline to deal with. But I think the bottom line, it's about your perception. You know, I think we've already seen some of the economists in the United States say that we haven't had a recession over the past bit, even though we did have 2 quarters of negative growth coming out of COVID. Revisionist history there to be said, but I think the term recession means something different depending on your position in the market. Any carrier out there, I would argue, anybody in the audience that operates equipment, telling me that they did not feel some level of recessionary pressure over the last bit, I don't think I would see very many hands out in the audience. Brokerages, similar situation. Now, from the shipping standpoint, Depends on what you're shipping.
Yep.
Home Depot, of course, had a big boom during COVID. They had a bit of a recessive period there towards the end because everybody remodeled their houses. And we can get into semantics, as Noel pointed out. But I think arguably for a large part of this audience and a large part of the people in this market, this is definitely a very recessive period that is in dire need of a correction.
Noel, can you talk to this slide? We talked about it a little bit last week. We haven't really covered it yet, which is showing. Can you walk us through what this is showing?
Sure. The blue line is the average growth over time in the total trucking market, so it's a combination of spot and contract. And when the squiggly line, the black line, is above the blue, that means we have more volume than normal. When it's below, we have less. So from a classic economic definition of recession, that's a recession. Even Werner is worried about surviving the next year. That's a recession. This over here, where we are now, is not. It's disappointing, but it's not. And I'm going to ask a question this way. Trucking, the ATA has a great slogan, trucking moves America. Everything in this room came here via truck. So trucking is classically what's called a coincidental indicator of the economy. We move with the economy. There's no other way to say it. The economy just grew by 2.6%, which is greater than average. How can trucking be in a recession if the economy is growing 2.6? So, and I'm not going to bore you with my answer, or no, that's not the word. The question that we need as an industry to answer is, how come I'm so disappointed when the economy is doing pretty good? What's the matter? And it's likely that the matter is us, not them. So them are doing pretty good. We're not doing so good. Or I'm disappointed because I'm only 10% above normal. What's the matter with my business? Why am I feeling like I'm in a freight recession? That's the real question before us today, the one that Zach has rightly emphasized.
So Zach, as time clicks down, the audience comes close to voting. What is your thought on what Noel just had to say there?
Yeah, I mean, supply and demand. There are two sides of that equation. Demand is one side that I think gets most of the emphasis. I've talked for several years now. I had to learn this lesson myself. Most of the time, we get away with looking at demand side indicators, and that's it. As a former financial analyst, looking at revenue alone, makes you feel good sometimes, but not always. And that's the way it is with demand. If you're looking at demand side indicators alone, the economy goes up and to the right most of the time in the United States. It is not a linear progress in most situations. You have to have some periods of recessiveness because we do get a little excited. We get a little over our skis with some stimulating activity. The American consumer cannot be denied his stuff or her stuff. And I think we've been purchasing lots more stuff here in the last couple of years. The work from home environment freed up a bunch of time during COVID, overstimulated things. Everybody went out, grabbed a truck, and they said, man, I can do this too. I can haul for $4 a mile and be home on the weekends. So because it was easy. It's easy to go get a truck. I go to the bank. The banks don't understand transportation markets that well. They don't know about cycles as well as we do. Most of the people in this room are extremely educated. The world is not, especially about transportation. So the one thing that has been the problem for a lot of the operators, a lot of the brokerages out there, is that we have had excessive supply. And it's because everybody had a little bit more time to go out and buy stuff during COVID. They had more time at home, which an argument nonetheless for having more time. It stimulates the economy and therefore benefits all the businesses. Back in the early 1900s, the Ford Motor Company gave people, they basically invented Saturday. And all of a sudden that created this boom and this need for the car. They did it because they needed to give their people time to go out and use the products that they build. And that's what happened during COVID. Very stimulating process, and that's what we're dealing with right now is that a lot of people went out, bought a truck, pushed those prices, those used truck prices up to $150K a piece. They're now down around 58. And that just tells you alone that there's just a huge imbalance in supply and demand that we are still slowly recovering from.
So, visiting team, our clock is winding down. We still have some time. Any closing comments, thoughts on the election, the recession, the lack of recession? Noel, it's been very entertaining to have you up here today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Really enjoyed it. What are your closing thoughts for the
So I want to just emphasize the point that Zach made about risk. We are in an extraordinarily risky environment. Whatever you say about the politics of Donald Trump, his management style is highly volatile and therefore risky. It may give better outcomes, it may give worse, but it's highly risky. The supply situation and pricing situation in trucking is a mess right now, and the geopolitical situation is the worst that I've experienced since back in the Vietnam days. So and the economy, demand side of the economy that Jack talked about is stale. We've been overbuying for a long time. So my message to my customers is that you need to be prudent for the next couple of years because all the risks are on the downside.
I think that is the big risk in the environment. Geopolitical environment right now is as chaotic as it has been in the past 30 years. And that's going to be the exogenous risk that the trucking market and anybody involved has to deal with. And it's the nature of the world. I think we've come to a point where we now are a little bit more fragmented. Supply chains, therefore, are going to be a little bit more maneuverable, flexible. They have to be. And that's going to create some volatility. So risk management is going to become a key component to anybody operating.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thank you. We'll let the audience get to voting. I'm sure Kaylee will run that. But thank you guys so much for your time today. Appreciate it.